Here on the Creative Thinker Podcast, we discuss all theories, philosophy, and thought behind the creative process. And we hope that you find some inspiration along the way. Hello, and welcome to the Creative Thinker Podcast. My name is Henry Moon, and I'll be your host. And our co-host today and every day is Michael Vasquez. How are we doing, Michael?
Hello. Doing good. Doing all right today?
I'm doing great, yeah. We got creative thinkers all over the globe joining us for today's episode, which makes it all that much more exciting.
Solid.
Today, we're getting into creating conflict and factions. But before we get into that, you had an announcement, didn't you?
Yes. Couple housekeeping things. So first off, thank you guys for following our Instagram page at CRTV Thinker, or THNKR. Ooh.
It's okay. Keep going. Hit it again. We're going to get this
the
right.
Instagram
it matters.
Our Creative Thinker Instagram, CRTV THNKR. Creative Thinker without the vowels.
Hey, there we go.
And then our new YouTube channel, Creative Thinker Podcast, that is CRTV THNKR Podcast on YouTube. Thank you guys for following the socials. Continued support on the social media would mean a lot to us. Next week, big announcement. We have freelance illustrator Shannon Kugienko coming on as we interview her in her creative process.
She was awesome. She did so good.
It was a really, really good interview. I'm really excited for that. Good friend, personal friend, and looking forward to that podcast coming out. That's March 26th.
Very insightful, too. Definitely check that out. There's so many things that go into the artistic process, and she explains them all just beautifully. Mm-hmm. Very well-spoken person, and her art's amazing, and we're going to share some of that in the podcast as well. So definitely tune in. Do not miss that interview with Shannon Kugienko. It's going to be epic.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to that. Today's podcast is brought to you by, no, not really, but it is run by Henry Moon Media LLC. Mm-hmm. We keep that afloat with users like you to take a phrase from not NPR, user-supported radio.
There we go.
Before I besmirch anyway, user-supported radio. So head over to anchor.fm/CRTVR. You got me doing it.
Oh, it's going to be a good one.
Anchor.fm/CRTVTHNKR and support us so that we can keep making dope content for you with reckless abandon. So today's podcast topic, creating conflict and factions, not just one but both. Mm-hmm. So we're going to be taking a deep dive into what we can do to create an effective power structure, an effective gang, an effective just villain that is going to be more to digest than just say one episode if you're writing an episodic, or one playthrough session if we're talking D&D. And we like to drop back and forth between both because we can. So we're just trying to give you a good thorough walkthrough of what it takes to make a really rich villainy. Mm-hmm. And that's what today's about. So Michael, can you break it down in a little bit better detail than that, or at least a little better explanation of what we're doing today?
Yeah, absolutely. So today, like you said, we're talking about conflict and what that conflict really comes from. Again, from a storytelling perspective, is factions, right? So those factions can either be, like you said earlier, gangs or just different opposing groups. A faction could be the heroes or the protagonist or antagonist group that is they're going to be affiliated with. The factions could be the government. It could be the small band here, a small group of people here. So factions can really be anything, and then make that structure in your system. So today, what I want to focus on a little bit more is how do you create a faction that feels alive, that feels like it can actually move in the world, and that isn't just going to be a one and done thing, that can actually continue through your story. If it's a novel or a short story, that it doesn't really just begin and end with the faction being introduced and I guess, eliminated depending on your story. As far
We're
as
trying to functionally avoid thin mayonnaise.
yes, reference to the thin mayonnaise. Yes, we're trying to avoid that and definitely, create some thick mayonnaise on our toast.
We need t-shirts. We need thin mayonnaise t-shirts.
You can get working on that.
But let's be serious. I'm sorry, Michael.
No, you're
I
good.
derailed it.
So one of the things that I wanted to start off with is just a faction that I have created before. Now, again, with D&D and my story building, I took a lot of inspiration from other sources, and what we're going to be talking about, you're going to recognize immediately where I'm taking this from if you're into action movies. So the faction that I'm going to be talking about today is the High Table. If you're not familiar with that, go and watch the John Wick movies and you will become very familiar with the High Table. So with the High Table and how I created this faction, I wanted to... There's not a lot of references for the High Table. I did try and take it almost directly from it, but there was just not enough lore there, so I had to create a lot of lore on my own. So in John Wick, they have a hotel that's called the Continental. That might be one of the only things that I took from this. A couple different words or terms, but I still created those and made those my own. So we have...
Retooled.
Yes, retooled.
Let's just say that before we get any...
Yeah, right?
Get any blowback.
For real. My top leader, unbeknownst to my players, is called the Elder. This is the leader of the High Table. So I have one person that's in charge of this faction, but they're not going to be the ones that understand everything that's going on in the world. They're going to have someone that's reporting to them so that they know generally what's going good and what's going bad. Underneath that person, they have the Adjudicator, right? So the top two people are the Elder and the Adjudicator.
So just a note before we get too much further, when you structure these,
Yeah.
the way you go through retooling or creating your villainy is that you start at almost like a corporate level and you work your way down. The big BBEG is first, and that's how you start. And then you build the faction on down. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I like to start that way because then I can see this is the powerful person. What is their goal, and how can the minions, I guess you would say, the people that are underneath them, how do they help this person achieve their goal? What's the story that this top person is telling everybody else, that what their goals or objectives are? How is this top leader helping everybody else? And then from figuring out this person's kind of personality and ideals and goals, I can then start having it funnel kind of down and get it twisted to where people are believing this person who is at the end of the day going to be the one creating a lot of the conflict for your heroes in your story. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. 110% from end to end. A perfect answer.
Sweet.
I'm sorry, I'm not being serious. It's a weird day.
That's good. That's good. So we have...
I'm
Again,
never serious. That's the wrong way to promote that. No, but you answered my question. I think I wanted to highlight that real quick before we get too far, just because it's almost like we're seeing a finished product, and one of the things that I want to make sure that we do on the podcast is just show people that it started somewhere, right? Like, we're not just going to show you a finished product and be like, yeah, good luck. Like those drawing books where it goes step 1, draw a circle, step 2, finished product, right?
Right, yeah.
So I just wanted to highlight that real quick.
And I will say this took me a very, very long time to create. I started off having just 2 factions. One was a gang that was the local gang, and this is like the well-connected gang. These are the people that have power. These are the people that have the connections. If they need to call in for reinforcements, no matter what, reinforcements are coming. And there's another gang in the city that is like, we don't mess with those guys because those guys are the ones who are going to beat us up. we're gonna stick. They let us stick to our territory, so we're gonna stay over here. It's kind of how it originated, and then I started to create a little bit more structure to it.
Nice.
Make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
Sweet. But like I said, so I started off with the top tier leaders, and then I go into, okay, who are going to be the leaders that these people are going to see then, and these are the minions that they're going to interact with. These are going to be, for the sake of like video game technology, these are the mini bosses that you want to defeat or overcome because they're going to be ever present in the game, and then they have their minions and their protections. So again, if I look at it technically, in the city that they're in, there are 3 mini bosses and one kind of big boss, and each one of these mini bosses has 2 higher level sentries or guards. And so the reason I did that is because I was playing D&D, and they needed people to defend themselves, and action economy in D&D needs a couple more people. But I also thought that there is this real interest in seeing there's the mini boss, and then here are the mini boss's sidekicks, pretty much. And these are the people that are going to be side by side with them for everything. So they almost created their own presence. Anytime a person came in that was one of the mini bosses, they came in with a presence, and then there were minions underneath that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you find that each stage you go down, the personality of the boss decides like who they hire almost, where it's like, yeah, the main guy can't have anybody else who's really strong tempered, and so he's got like sycophants at his level, but the sycophants hire people that they can boss around. So it's like, it's just sort of like this rotation. It's like a natural personality change through the layers of the organization. Do you find that that's something you aim for, or is that something that happens naturally?
So it's a little bit of both. I aim for having different personalities there so that you guys find it interesting, right? So that the audience finds it interesting. Because if you had, again, using D&D terms, if you had like a barbarian mini boss, and there were also 2 more barbarian mini bosses, then it's like, well, that's not really a lot of variety. It's not really fun. You know what you're going to be getting every single time, versus just kind of the main boss in this area is kind of more of a barbarian. And also I want it to be interesting. So I want to create something different, like I can't just have the same thing over and over, but I also wanted it to feel alive. So the mini bosses all had their sentries with them, but I wanted their stories to actually make sense. And in the game, I believe like one of the mini bosses died, and the sentry started crying because it was like, I failed so bad on my job that like it's bringing her to emotions because she wasn't able to defend him. And that's kind of like the connection that I wanted to bring there for these mini bosses to make them really feel alive. Does that make sense? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers my question. I think it's whenever I try to create large groups of people or a town or something, it's like I look for, after I've got basically the characters named and laid out, it's like I start to look for emotional connection between people, and then really try to heighten that as much as I can, or make it known. So like, most people aren't going to guess if you get a side glance between 2 characters that are maybe like power wise shouldn't know each other, but you can tell that they do. It's like, it's enough to say something's off, or something's different, or there's something to look for there. And I like to be able to drop those throughout the story because that heightens people's curiosity of what's going on. And so I just was curious whether that's something you're building in, because it sounds like you are. I just didn't know if it was intentional or like a passive, this is cursory or like a consequence of how you're creating.
Yeah. So some of the people that I created, so like that, the one mini boss whose sentry ended up like crying because she failed, that boss actually had a really big impact on the city, and in y'all's story, unbeknownst to y'all, because at the time y'all hadn't asked for a lot of people's names and last names, and also like it's kind of tough as a DM to be like, okay, their name is this and their last name is this, and sometimes it's tough as a writer or a storyteller to continually come up with different names. But this person was actually connected not only to this faction, but they were also connected to the faction of the government politics in the city. And they were also connected to this other group that y'all kind of had some animosity with. Again, unbeknownst to y'all until pretty recently, this person, had a lot of impact. And that was intentional.
Beef with everybody, for the record. Right? That's
Yeah.
That's what the trope is for, not trope, but the thing is for D&D, murder hobos.
Mm-hmm.
They made it for that. We have beef with everybody. That's like the point, right?
Yeah, it kind of is. And that's what, these people are supposed to do. They were supposed to create the conflict for you guys. And so immediately, I don't know how far away we want to get away from like the structure of this organization, but immediately when y'all were in another city, their rules are very similar to what I talked about in a previous podcast with Port Lennis, where it's like you're not supposed to spill blood here. This is supposed to be a safe haven. You're supposed to be able to conduct business here. And y'all were in a continental, in a mountain city, and the characters just like they were got off to a rough start, got off on the wrong foot, to say the least. And then from there was just tension. And as y'all began to investigate a little bit more, it's like, oh, this person is not really a good person. But their presence was, not just in y'all's home-based city, but in other cities around the continent.
Well, I think that's enough probably background before we dive back into the structure of the gang. And I'll try to like dip in with questions every now and again, just if I feel like we're leaving anybody out.
Yeah.
So we got the first two.
Right. And so then the first two, these are the people, again, the top leader over the entire continent, is how I have it structured. The second one is also over the continent, but they are actually visiting these continentals. They're actually visiting the locations. They're visiting the managers. Right. So again, in John Wick, there's the manager of the continental is kind of the big boss. You don't really mess with them. And here, the managers on each continental, they are the BBEG, the big bad evil guy of the continental. They're the ones who, if they need to bring down the hammer, they bring down the hammer. They're in charge of the city. The managers are in charge of the city, and then from there, the managers have their own people who are in charge of different things. And I don't remember if y'all had really got this information or not. But
we had to fight our way through, and it went very quickly and badly.
Yeah. It's
how many revive spells we needed, but
it was a lot, but it was good. It was good. So the manager has three bosses, all right? These are the mini bosses that we talked about earlier, and each one of them has a job. And so the reason I structured that is so that they could, again, feel more alive into the story instead of just saying, well, here's the manager and here are the assistant managers,
Well, that's really important, too. Like, I think what a lot of people lose when they're building factions specifically is that not everybody has a purpose, or that purpose that person has is not actually useful to the goings-on of the gang or the goings-on of, like the, some people will be thoughtful enough to include like this gang member's family in some way, but even at that, it's like, well, they're just telling them that they're going to be home for dinner or something. It's like when you watch a TV show and there's they call it the moment before in script writing, but when somebody drops a moment before that's really meaningful, that it's like, well, I just like, or really impactful in a short way, like I forget which movie. Anyway, where he says like he's dressed in black and his other crony or whatever you want to call him says like, why are you dressed like that? You look depressed. And he's like, I just came from my grandma's funeral. And then it's like the gun battle happens and they get like just murdered brutally, like they're villains, right? And it's like in that 1 second, that one line, it's like we got their whole backstory to a degree other than their visual presence, but then and then they died, and it's like you feel a loss at that. If you're able to build in sort of a more three-dimensional character, you can describe their lives in a line or two, and that is a really rich way to tell a story. So continue.
Yeah, no, that's good. So yeah, I wanted the mini bosses to really have their own job, because I felt like this structure that I'm setting up for your city that y'all are in, I set up in all the cities. So this structure is across the board. There's the elder, the adjudicator, and then every city has a manager. And then they have the mini bosses' jobs are the collector, the whisperer, and the spear. And so each one of them has their own different unique thing. The collector, they're in charge of posting and distributing the bounties. Wow. The whisperer, we call him the keeper of secrets. They command spies and know all the positions in the continent. So I would put someone like the whisperer, like Varys in Game of Thrones, who has all the spies that are all around. It's kind of where I took that from. And then lastly, the spear. This is the arms manager. They are the buyer and the supplier for the high table. And arms aren't necessarily just weapons, but it's also magic items. So these are the people who are doing kind of like the black market dealings. They're getting magic items from certain areas. They're paying people off to make certain things. They're stealing items from other people. And those three are in communication with each other so that all three of them are on the same page. And again, each one of these three are so important. They have sentries that are with them at all times. And then again, to kind of make it alive and living, each one of those sentries has a different class as far as D&D goes. And even all the three mini bosses all had different classes as well, so that there is just a lot of variety there for the players. And so that's very much how I have the structure as far as the people with names, right? And then from there, we have cutthroats and enforcers. Cutthroats would be like the rogues. Those are the people who are going out and doing the spying or the stealings. And the enforcers are the people who are, the bodyguards. The ones who aren't sentries, but it's the manpower.
Something else story-wise that you add, at least in the playthrough, that I thought was really cool and an interesting... something I hadn't really seen too much before in D&D stuff that I've watched is like, depending on, like, you even have shifts built into the game. So it's like, okay, well, we're going to go in the middle of the afternoon. So it's like you check your chart and it's like, okay, well, this person's working, these people are at home. And depending on where their home is in town, and where we're set up, when they show up, we may or may not run into them, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's like there's geographical elements, which is really cool, and there's timing elements that are really cool, and it's also like, I don't know, it just all feels very real because they're behaving in the world. They have sort of it's very much like a video game because they have functions that they go through every day.
Mm-hmm.
And then occasionally, if it's a special event, they may be gone, they may be out of town, but it's like everybody has their lives, and everybody is important and well thought out. And I think that's super cool. And it's if you're gonna, especially if you're writing D&D, it's sort of like it can be on occasion like, here's some people to kill, go for it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't need to do backstory because they're going to be dead in 30 seconds. But for stories, for sure, like long form books and things like that, it's really cool to give your sort of B and C characters a little bit of a story that you can jump into and understand. And I was reading again The Expanse, and the little notes, there's maybe 2 or 3 sentences a chapter where it's just observations of the station that they're in, and the detective just notices, like, so-and-so isn't here, it's 3:00, they're supposed to be. It's like just one sentence, almost a throwaway. He's just looking around and he notices that someone's not there, and I'm still early on in the book I'm reading, but it's like that may or may not come back. I'm sure it will, but it's just cool notes that make everything feel alive.
And it's really interesting because those notes, especially as you're a player for D&D, like, people will pick up on that stuff. So it's like, okay, this person showed up late, or they'll start asking what time are they showing up, or when are they going to show up, what's their shift, how long are they on shift. As a player, you see that with like guards everyone takes shifts, and as someone who has worked many a night shift, I understand like the different shifts that happen, just at work. And so it's like, okay, how do I create kind of that atmosphere here in this D&D setting? Because you see that in a lot of like I guess action movies, whether it's fantasy or not, that they notice when the guards are not facing this certain area, or they'll go during a guard switch or a guard change. And so I wanted to make that feel real and alive here, because you see it in movies, and so people want to emulate the movies. And if you're reading, you want that entertainment, and you want that like, oh, the suspense of like they have 5 minutes to climb up the wall or go here, or you have 5 minutes to go and get a bounty on one of these mini bosses. So
what's the benefit of factions versus like just a BBEG?
Man, I mean, it's more interesting because these factions don't just appear once and then you have to fight them and then that's it. It's not a good story. There are times and places for that. Like, man, it's really tough because I try and make everything into a story. But I guess at the time, like when y'all had an encounter in a tower, you're making your way through. It was like a dungeon crawl, and you're making your way through all these people. And at the time, just enemies. It was nothing more than just different enemies I was throwing at you guys. I wanted you guys to use your stuff and really go ham on your character's abilities. And then at the top there is a beholder, because beholders are cool, so like it's fun. If you've seen Legend of Vox Machina, they fight a beholder in there, and it's a really cool scene, and I wanted that to feel epic for you guys as well.
It definitely did.
But that was a case though of like, it felt fun, it felt epic, but as far as story beats, there wasn't really anything there until much later. But that story beat wasn't as interesting. If that just opened up and was like, well, there's this dungeon crawl y'all can do, and there was no like reward for doing it or no interest, then like what's the point in doing it? Your characters could be like, well, this is more interesting. So having these factions, especially like fighting or being in conflict with the other gang, because y'all were affiliated with a smaller gang, and this big gang is like trying to bow up on you guys essentially, and they're like, nah, let's try and take them out. You guys are starting to get strong. Here are the 3 bounties. If you can take out these mini bosses, we actually have a chance of starting to push these people out of our city, and then we can take our city and we can be in charge of our city. And I felt like that was just a much better framework versus just the big boss being like, get out of here and I'm going to fight all of you guys. And he's like, no, when do you ever see, top store management leaders come down and deal with the minions? You don't ever see that happen. So he was sending his minions to go and take care of the problem. And then the problem got so high, y'all went to him. But, like, I guess he did eventually go down to you guys, but it took a while. It took a build up to get there.
I think Star Wars, the movies, are a good example of the stories you can have with the people along the way. Mm-hmm. Because it's and I was thinking of Tartarus too, talking about D&D, but mm-hmm. That when you structure the whole gang or the whole evil, the dark side, whatever, into a CEO or a corporate company structure, then it's like each new person becomes their own story. It's mm-hmm. like if you kill off, a management level person, but it's low level management, then they've just got a replacement like that next day.
Yep.
And then suddenly they're your problem, mm-hmm. and they're a totally different person. And you realize, well, I got to go above them then. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of stories that are like that, but I feel like each one, if you allow in D&D your players to kind of like push on the bad guys, if you push on each evil person, then they can decide whether they're going to going to get invested in that story and going to track it down and see who they're attached to. And it's just a very rich way to tell stories. And I remember with Tartarus, who is one of the BBEGs, if you want to, he turned into a BBEG.
He was the manager of the Continental that y'all were in.
Oh, gotcha. So I never picked up on that.
He was the top dog, right? So he was the one that was dealing with everything.
I thought they called him in.
No, he was the manager. That was his city. He just never went out and dealt with anything until he had to.
Gotcha.
Right? So that was how I wanted it to feel is, you know, you guys interacted with other people a part of the high table. But when the manager came, I mean, like you said, it felt like someone got called in. It's like, no, this is his city. He's just now making his presence known. Like, you guys are messing with the wrong people. And of course, you know, chaos ensued. But
yeah, but since he was a part of the high table, and we'd already gotten rid of and fought so many super powerful people, and it was so difficult. And like I said, we went through so many revivify and you know, everything we had to stay alive, we'd already gone through.
Yeah.
And then we had some day where we just felt like, okay, well, we're just going to mess around. And then that's when he showed up, and it was like, it was one of the first times in D&D, like, you get super invested. If you've never played, it's like, because it's theater of the mind, your imagination allows you to react more strongly than it would to other forms of media or movies or whatever. And it was like, it was raining, and then he was like, oh yeah, and then Tartarus from the high table is in the street. And it's like, I just feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I was like, because we'd been fighting against them for a year, and it's like, we were at a point where we hadn't gone adventuring in a little while, and we were basically like just broke.
Y'all were vulnerable is what it was. You were vulnerable, and they saw that. And that's one of the things, you know, like, to make the world feel alive as far as like factions go, and creating the conflict. Like, there are consequences for failure within the heroes group, the heroes faction, and the faction that you're opposing. So at that point, y'all had killed 2 of the mini bosses. One of them escaped, and y'all haven't dealt with that yet. But Tartarus had to answer to the adjudicator, and the adjudicator punished him, and he lost everything. So that's why he didn't come in with his sentries. He came in with his own clan, because he had to go and reach out to his clan that he has not been a part of, and is like, I need to restore my honor, and I have to go and kill this group that just decimated and embarrassed me as a leader, because y'all came in force. You killed all of his minions. You made one of his mini bosses run the hell out and just go into hiding pretty much. And he's like, I have failed here. Let me redeem my honor. And so if y'all ever attempted to scry on him, which is like seeing him from like a different area through magical means, y'all would have seen him get in trouble with the adjudicator and pretty much get reprimanded. And then that's why he was like, okay, let me figure out what's going on. Where is this group? And then they went and found you guys in Meridian.
Dang. That's a lot of lore drop just now.
Yeah.
I'm going to completely change how I play the game. No. But we're talking about this in terms of like, I guess what I want to point out is that we're talking about this in terms of just people who are a part of a business, and it's one that they take very seriously. And that is exactly the same as the heroes. We're just telling the story from a different perspective.
Yep.
And I think what so many people get wrong the first few times out is that they try to create a villain that's really despicable and terrible, and there's really no redeeming factor to them. And that's not what makes a good villain.
Right.
It's like a good villain, you love them. Like, you just enjoy the time, movies, you enjoy them on the screen.
Yeah.
Every second that they're a part of the show, you're like, wow, that is cool. That's terrifying. Like, you want to be just awed. And you're not going to be that way if there's nothing to relate to. Exactly. There's no reason behind the action. It's just, evil for evil's sake,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And so like that's what you do really well, and that's why I think it was cool to go through the structure of your faction, because each one of those characters that you've talked about, we learned so much about in game,
Mm-hmm.
and I know how rich those characters are. I know how fond I am of the memories of fighting them in game.
Yeah.
And so it's, I don't know, I'm enjoying hearing the bare bones version, I guess.
Yeah. And so that's where like structure in your story is going to help. And I think we talked about this the other day. Like you're more creative when there's structure. And so I was able to create this structure as far as, you know, the elder, adjudicator, manager. The manager has 3 mini bosses, we'll call them, and they have their thing. And then of course, if you look at my Excel spreadsheet, like I need to switch these. And so I have Fine Star here, and then I have another city that's going to be here. And there's a whole nother group of people down here. So like I have it set up, you know, for each city. I have this template and I can use it for each city. And it doesn't always have to follow the exact same thing as far as like the manager and then the rest of the jobs. But it helps to at least have some type of structure. In our cities episode that we talked about Meridian and how there are these towers that are there. So I have structure for those. The factions there are mage guilds, and there's a paladin group. And when you think of paladin, you think of like a holy warrior. Well, here in this city, they are the security. So the paladins reach certain levels of being the security. So there's like high security, there's adventurers, there's guardians, and then there's just students, and they're just, you know, they're beginner paladins as far as the game goes. But that helped me figure out, oh, okay, this is the structure of, you know, the career path these certain classes can take. And that helps me write that story because I don't have to think too hard about it. If I can look at a class and be like, okay, I want them to be, you know, a magic user, they're probably gonna have gone through here, and then that's gonna bring them, depending on their power level, to a certain ranking. That helps me because those are 2 different factions that I can then use pretty much anywhere in the world and anywhere in my story.
So we talked about structure.
Mm-hmm.
But what I want to get into right now, we talked about like factions. How do you, number one, how do you decide who gets to be the BBEG?
Mm-hmm.
And number 2, and I feel like we should get into monster creation a little bit here too, but we'll do that after. But so how do you choose who the BBEG is? And then number 2 is how do you make your villains interesting? So say like the mid-level people,
Mm-hmm.
How do you make them ominous? How do you make them a little bit more, or a unique challenge, I guess is what I'm trying to say. How do you make them a unique challenge?
I think from like a D&D perspective, unique is tough because especially y'all are at a higher level, so you've seen a lot of things. But as far as making them unique as a villain, it's looking at different sources and seeing, okay, I really like, you know, in our villains episode, I talk about how I enjoyed Negan from Walking Dead. Okay, so what were things that I liked about that, and how can I add that element here into the story? So one of the things for Negan specifically was, you know, I am Negan. We are all Negan. No one's going to rat out Negan. So that loyalty level of we are Negan, it's like, how can I bring that into my game? I necessarily haven't brought that kind of topic in, but you kind of piecemeal little pieces of information and you let people hear about this person. You might not necessarily hear how strong or how powerful they are, but it's just a little bit here and there. In passing conversation, you hear of, you know, this person and you don't know what it's going to be. You know, for trying to think of how much I want to talk about y'all's campaign for stuff that
I know you're just lore dropping like crazy right now.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of
I have a terrible memory. You're safe.
Okay, so let's talk about Saphira. She was the big bad for y'all's I would say like you're the halfway point for y'all's campaign as far as I think y'all were level 11 or 12. So how we continue to make her feel as strong as she was and feel, this powerful, ominous creature. Like if we're going to attack, like we need to gather armies, which is what y'all did, was just piecemealing how powerful she was over the course of this thing and this thing. So, y'all killed little baby dragons. That's kind of what started it. Retroactively, it was a random encounter table, and then I was like, let's make a story out of it. But then the babies that y'all killed, or the young ones, they weren't babies. The young dragons y'all killed at the end of the quest that y'all are at, a blue dragon came in at the end of your quest and kind of like circled around. It was like, this dragon is upset. It has now recognized that its kin are dead and it is destroying the structure that you're in. What are you guys doing? Y'all ended up hiding and getting out of the structure and not taking damage. But then it went on a rampage and left. It went to go then tell the kind of the nest. The dwarves killed my dragons. So then the retaliation happened.
Gotcha.
So then these dragons now come and attack y'all in Harvest. And as y'all entered Harvest in our cities episode, I kind of described it. But if you remember, once y'all entered into the city, after the first wall, baby dragon parts start falling, right? Because a dragon comes down and poof, hits the ground. And it's like, oh, now there are dragons like coming down and they're going to just slowly start trying to tear away this city. And as far as like dragons go, those were just tier 2 dragons. And Saphira is like a tier 6 or tier 7 dragon. So it was just slowly like inching your way. And then you hear the word Saphira. You see Saphira. Saphira begins to let her name be known, but only in name and never visually seeing her power. And then it was always like, oh man, this is, if this dragon that we fought was this strong, can you only imagine how strong the next dragon was? And then I gave one of the dragons magic, and then there was multiple dragons, and then dragons were able to polymorph into certain things. So it was just this slow build over time, and just accepting that you guys are going to eventually run into it. The story will take it where it needs to go. I don't need to rush this going forward. And then sure enough, y'all found it out. And like I said, y'all had armies there to attack. And even still, like, that was a rough fight. Like, it was still very rough. I think a couple things had to happen specifically for her to go down, and teleporting inside her body and inside her heart and attacking her heart was probably one of the biggest things that could have happened, even though she was able to like gain hit points later and still make another attack at you guys. Y'all put a lot of battle tactics
and rolled well.
And rolled well. Y'all
it was
also
a high DC for that teleportation.
Yeah. So like, that's how I created her as being such a big villain, was just the presence was always there throughout everything. And even in times of like, and this was a tough balance to have in times of, humor or stuff like, don't forget she's still there. She sees you. She sends a message to one of you. It's like, hey, I'm still here. Don't forget about me. And just that constant reminder of like, don't forget about me. I'm still coming for you. I will always be coming for you. It's
suspense, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like adding to the suspense. It's like, it's built into the structure of this corporate model that we've been talking about. It's built into the structure, but it's also that you're building into the story by, like you're saying, just these little drops, these little hints. Mm-hmm. Now we met a boss, and the boss says, yeah, well, I report to this person, and this person reports to this person,
mm-hmm.
And you may get there eventually, but you're not there yet.
Right.
And I don't know. It's been really fun playing through that story.
Yeah, it's been fun creating it. And just like another tease, another way that I use that for D&D is like looking at the book Aragon. I feel like at the end of each book, he continued to hear about the big bad, but it was like, oh, you're only meeting like like I said, like tier 1 or tier 2. And as each book progressed, it was like, okay, now he's facing something a little bit stronger, a little bit stronger. But they hear about this person, even to the point of seeing the big bad and just being frozen and unable to do anything. I think that's something to remember is don't rush the villain. These factions are factions so that they can work their way up. You can work your way through the story to get to the big boss, because if you rush it, it almost feels like you're not doing your villains and your work the service that it deserves.
Yeah, I think past that, conflict can be created through so many things. And it can be created from something that's so simple. Just wanting what the other person has is conflict. Or just like a sideways glance can be conflict. I feel like rom-coms do conflict really well, because it's just so, maybe not mundane is the wrong word, but it's so ordinary everyday life. And for rom-coms, it's like it stops pretty much there. The stakes are pretty low because at the end they get together. But it's like it could very easily go from like rom-com stakes to like neither person is letting this go. And then if they have to occupy the same space and one of them's willing to kill, well, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like it can ramp up endlessly, but it can start someplace that is pretty mundane, and we're all used to the conflict we feel. Anything that annoys you, they have movies. I forget what it was. It was a Samuel L. Jackson, Ben Affleck movie. That was about being cut off in traffic on a bad day, and then basically they try to kill each other. So it's like anything that you get frustrated about, annoyed with, can be high enough stakes for an all-out war or a faction or whatever. Maybe they're selling drugs in the same part of town. It doesn't. Anything that you can think of is a good enough conflict, as long as you put the structure and the actual daily activities of that villain, of that person, into your story and show the moment before, to use the vernacular.
Yeah.
So I think that's what's really cool about living in your story or playing games in your stories is that there's always something going on. There's always somebody that is on their way somewhere, or and just like in real life, like everybody has a boss. There's nobody that's like at the pinnacle of that. Everybody reports to somebody.
Exactly.
And as long as you keep that in mind and let that live out in actuality in your story, and keep the consequences real. So if somebody loses $1 million hotel and they give them a slap on the wrist and say, well, have a good day.
Right.
That's not very realistic. Or like if they are trying to get a bounty that's like worth $10 and they lose them and then they get beheaded. You know what I mean? Keep your consequences real and grounded in something real, but also keep your characters grounded in something real. I think that even no matter what your genre is, that's going to be the right answer.
For sure.
What were you going to say? You almost said something.
Oh man, what was the last thing you said? It came in and left.
You got to keep your characters grounded in reality.
And that's the beauty of like the continuation of a story is the consequences will continue to go as little as a slap on a wrist to no, now the consequences are high level. We've been chasing this, and as your story progresses, consequences get higher because the risk is higher, the reward is higher. And same thing with D&D. The consequences are higher because the reward is higher, because y'all are higher level and typically want the higher level stuff or in a higher level story. So yeah, that just it clicked for me that each consequence and each action is going to continue to increase in risk as you continue your story, and to feel real, right? Because like if I was 18 at my job and I didn't show up for work 3 days in a row and I got fired, okay, there's not really that many consequences. Like, yeah, I got fired, but like I really don't care. Like, what bills do I have to do, whatever. But then when I'm like 22, it's like, okay, if I lose my job, or 24, it's like if I lose my job, then it's inconvenient. Like, I'm gonna have to really go and look for another job. But then like now, it's like if I lost my job now, I'd be like, oh dang, like this is really
I'm about
rough.
to lose so much.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, I have a lot more to lose now. We have families to provide for. Like I can't afford not working, and I can't afford not making what I was making. So like just as a part of life, like the consequences also increase so your stories should.
Yeah, I feel like using time to your advantage is essentially. I feel like the short version, the takeaway version, is as long as you're letting time progress and not resolving the initial conflict, whatever it is, it's going to build. Like building resentment, building everything,
Yeah.
So like it naturally amps up, and the more you interact with it, the more it's going to amp up. As long as it's interaction without resolution, you can resolve like small parts, like in that. I keep wanting to say Collateral, but that's definitely not it. Anyway, in that movie with Samuel L. Jackson and Ben Affleck, he gets a lawyer at some point, I think. It's been so long since I've seen it. But he gets a lawyer or something, basically humiliates the guy to his face and thinks, well, that's enough. And then about, I guess 10 minutes movie time later, he realizes that's not really enough for him. He wants revenge. He needs to get back at him, right?
Yeah.
And I forget why. There was something that they did to amp it up a little bit more. But anyway, even the resolutions, as long as they're hollow enough, can satisfy that need to resolve something in the story, and also for the viewer, but also, amp things up.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I feel like we covered pretty much everything for this conflict episode with factions. Hashtag with factions.
And so that was one faction. I described a second faction, but really what it is just create some type of structure for your story, whether it's good or whether it's bad, in conflict with your characters. Every faction is going to have something that they want. And it's important to remember that every person has something they want, and sometimes it's comes in conflict with your heroes, your protagonists. Sometimes it comes in conflict with other people, and then you kind of deal with the repercussions of what that is. So, I highly recommend, now that I've been creating factions, on looking up videos on how to create factions as well. Kind of re-listen to this and see how I did it, and see how you can use it in your story, because having this makes me feel like that part of the story was the most structured and one of the most memorable stories that I felt like we had as a collective storytelling group.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah, so I feel like the structure was very important, and having this faction design just made me even more excited about it.
And the cool thing about once you make the structure is that you could literally switch out all the names and then change like what their core function is, what their title is, and you could just use that same structure in a different gang,
Exactly.
And if you change one or two things, it's almost indiscernible, really. So I think that's cool for any structure creation is kind of that way.
As a DM, you learn just to reuse stuff that either was good or either you weren't able to use because that's just not how the players went. Scenes, characters, plot hooks, like you can always reuse that stuff. And factions, yeah, like you said, you just twist it a little bit and it's a completely new faction in a completely different setting.
Just because it's easy doesn't mean it's wrong.
That's right.
So make with the mayonnaise. Make with the mayonnaise out there, people. Make sure you get from one end to the other of your story, and do what it takes to do so. Make it fun. Make it intense, and try to build out your factions, your villains, and make them into real life people that you can relate to. Something that you didn't talk about that I wanted to say in this episode before we move on. One final thing, folks.
Yep.
You have photos of just about every character in this spreadsheet that you're working on.
I do, yes.
How important are those photos to the characters themselves?
They are, because when you're talking about let's go back to here. So when you're talking about, here's all the ones you guys killed.
The graveyard. Scroll over to the graveyard.
Yeah, so I kept that so as I could remember what these characters are and remember who these characters, how important they were to the story. these pictures help me, because pictures, what do they say? Pictures are worth 1,000 words or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it helps me really connect and make them into people. As a DM, sometimes it's like, okay, you describe them. Sometimes my descriptions might not be the best. I'll turn it over. They're like, oh no, that's actually what I envisioned. I was like, cool.
Like, here's a new stat block for you guys, right?
Right. No. So I'll show a picture of the NPC and be like, this is what I envision this NPC to look like. Maybe there's a tweak that you have to do here or there, but it really helps me look and create depth to the character. Like in our ship podcast where we're talking about the unique quirks, this is where I get my quirks from. Like, okay, so this guy has a maul in his hand. He's a tiefling. He's got a high jacket. So like, he's kind of gonna have more of like a goth element to it,
Like Interview with a Vampire. That's what that guy looks like.
Yeah.
He's just like a bit of an emo kid from the 90s, but as a tiefling.
And then this right here was one of his sentries. So it's this woman in full armor, pretty much, and she's got colors on her armor that represent something, her family maybe. Maybe it's the colors of the high table. And she's got like a buzz haircut on the side, and it's long on the other side. So I envision her. I know people who have that kind of haircut, and so like I kind of put that personality on that NPC, and like the quirks that they have, I'll put into the NPC, because the people that you interact with on a daily basis, you're probably going to be able to imitate them, and so you don't have to go far to create whole new characters when you're like, oh, this person's going to be like someone at work I know, and they have this tendency to, whenever they don't know, put their hand over their head, and they're just like kind of like this all the time, and they stumble with what they're talking about, and so like you can take those and make them into your characters. And so that's why I use images, because then I can start piecemealing, this is their character, this is how they're going to talk, this is how they're going to act, this is another boss. So like, just by looking at that picture, what do you like? You get a feel from it, and it creates them trying to be, living, breathing NPCs.
So I think the takeaway from today's episode, to endeavor to wrap up and say what I think I learned today, again, is that I think the takeaway is use everything at your disposal. Mm-hmm. Don't be ashamed of that. Don't be, beating yourself up over it. And don't be stingy with it. Mm-hmm. Dive in with both feet, and, use pictures, use music, use stories you've read before, seen before, use friends and family, mm-hmm. use things that you know and understand. Yep. It helps make things really rich. It helps make things lifelike. And then the other thing is that the more structure you can create, however you can create it, whether it's an outline to your story, whether it's a map, whether it's, using pictures and assigning it to one of your characters, every single one of those hems you in a little bit further, mm-hmm. To where you think the character is. But, and the inclination or the thought, especially if you're early on in your craft, is that the more things you add like that, the less creativity you have, the less things that you're adding to your character. Mm-hmm. But it's sort of the opposite, in that it makes your character more and more rich. Each thing, as you are going to be the glue tying all those different pieces together. Mm-hmm. And that's where your creativity is you're taking all these ideas, all these observations, all these people, and you're gluing them together. And mm-hmm. that new thing that you just made, the amalgamation of all those ideas, is what's going to be uniquely you and uniquely your character. Mm-hmm. So, the more structure you can have is definitely the better. And I couldn't stress enough, if you're making a large group of people in your head, you got to have structure. You got to have that written down. You have to have an outline. You have to have, mm-hmm. like an Excel spreadsheet that is one of the most detailed things I've ever seen on your computer here.
It didn't start that way. And yeah. I think that's also the important thing, is remember to write it down and slowly get better at organizing it.
Yeah, organization's huge. So we hope you learned something today. Thank you so much, creatives all over the world. creative thinkers, especially all over the world. We thank you so much for joining today. Michael, thanks for sharing your process.
Yes, I hope you guys learned something, take something away. And if you learn something or have any questions, again, just hit us up on our social medias, comment below. We really appreciate the fan interaction.
And please support the channel at anchor.fm/CRTVTHNKR. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.